Hi everyone, this is Rob Garris. I'm the Global Director of Admissions for Schwartzman Scholars, and I'm going to share a presentation with you that'll take about 20 minutes. At the end, I'll give you contact information so you can follow up with any questions that you might have. But let me start just by giving you a little bit of background on the long-term vision for Schwartzman Scholars, what it is that Steve Schwartzman hoped to achieve by creating this program. He really created Schwartzman Scholars with a long-term goal in mind, and that was to build a global network of people who are in leadership roles in politics, in business, in the nonprofit world, who on the one hand are better in their leadership roles by virtue of understanding how China is influencing the field in which they work, but also very importantly, if not more importantly, Steve Schwartzman wanted to ensure that this group of global leaders are able to serve as bridges between China and their home countries or China and their organizations. There have been many points in history where a new country rose to global power and disrupted existing power structures, and that created conflict between countries. And Steve wanted to be sure that the next generation of global leaders can help prevent tensions and misunderstandings between China and the rest of the world and help integrate China into the global system in ways that are peaceful and prosperous for everyone. What I'm going to share with you in this presentation is information on the campus, and by that I mean Tsinghua University as well as Schwartzman College, a new entity within Tsinghua University. We'll talk about academics, and that's the one-year global master's in our Masters in Global Affairs at Tsinghua University. It's an intensive one-year program, and it's important that we spend some of our time talking about that. And then last but certainly not least, we'll talk about the admissions process. Let me start by saying a little bit about Tsinghua University. Tsinghua is the top university in China. It's ranked at the top of global rankings for universities in the country and also leads rankings in Asia as a whole. In addition to being one of the leading institutions in the region, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that are relevant to the Schwartzman Scholars Program, why Tsinghua University is an especially strong partner for Schwartzman Scholars. And I'll start with a little bit about Tsinghua's history. It was founded more than 100 years ago, at that point in time with the very express purpose of building stronger ties between China and the United States. Over the intervening century, Tsinghua has developed into a much broader institution with a much broader mission. It's one of the leading research universities in China, but among all of the leading universities in the country, it also has the most international perspective, the strongest international connections, and that's a reflection of its founding history. The other thing about Tsinghua University that also makes it a really strong partner in this project of building a global network of leaders is that for a generation now, Tsinghua has already been developing the leadership of China. Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao are two names that you might recognize who are alumni of Tsinghua University, but really throughout the national government in many different ministries, in provincial government, in businesses around China, you'll find Tsinghua alumni who are playing leadership roles and exercising influence throughout the country. So as we look to build this program that's going to create a new generation of leaders around the world who have strong ties to China, Tsinghua brings to that project the existing leadership of the country. What you're seeing here is a new entity within Tsinghua University that's called Schwartzman College. And we've built Schwartzman College as an integral part of the university to serve as a home base for this program. It's a residential college, so it's the home not only for the students who are Schwartzman Scholars, but also for many of the faculty who teach them. And here at Schwartzman College, your academic life and your residential life are integrated into one unified program. You're looking now at one of the dorm rooms in Schwartzman College. Fairly unusual in the Chinese university system. Every Schwartzman scholar has his or her own private dorm room. This is designed in part to give you the comfort and the privacy of your own dorm space, but we also have clustered these dorm rooms in groups of 8 around shared living space. And we'll assign you to that living cluster to maximize the international diversity, the professional diversity in each of those groups, so that you're constantly learning from your fellow Schwartzman scholars, even when you're here in this relatively private residential space in the building. There are other parts of the building that are designed to help ensure that you build connections and relationships throughout the university and with the professional community in China, and in fact the leadership community around the world. You're looking now at the main auditorium, the Dalio Auditorium for Schwartzman Scholars. What happens here in the auditorium are major events. Twice a week, roughly twice a week, we have major leaders from global corporations, from countries around the world, and from China who come to speak to Schwartzman Scholars about their own experience of leadership and about trends within their field. Very often those leaders will then stay on after the large public event in this room and have dinner with Schwartzman Scholars in a much smaller setting, typically in a group of 8 or 10 scholars who are chosen to have dinner with that leader and continue that conversation about their leadership and their experience in a much smaller setting. This auditorium is built to be larger than the cohort of Schwartzman Scholars so that we can invite other Tsinghua faculty, Tsinghua students, and others from the community to join us for these kinds of public events and help build the sorts of connections that we think are important not only within the community of Schwartzman Scholars, but between Schwartzman Scholars and others who are at Tsinghua and there in Beijing. I'll say a little bit now about the master's degree in global affairs. The degree program is a very intensive 11-month master's program, so there are times in the year where your experience is a very tight-knit cohort experience focused on the classroom, and then at other points in the year it opens up so that there's either some diversity in terms of what you're studying as a group of Schwartzman Scholars, or even later in the year your experience moves off campus. But let me start first with the shared core curriculum, which is in that very intensive inward-facing cohort mode. At the beginning of the year, essentially between August and November, you'll do a set of 5 courses with your fellow Schwartzman Scholars, and you'll do this in a very intensive, very focused sort of way. The core curriculum has 2 themes to it. One is leadership, and the other is how China is relating to the rest of the world. And these classes serve to create a common knowledge base for all of the scholars that then informs the rest of your classwork and the rest of your learning experience over the course of the year. I mentioned that there are 5 classes. I'm not going to go into all of the details on those classes, but we'll just share with you some very high-level observations. You'll choose 4 out of these 5 classes, so you don't do all 5, but you still share most of this content in common with your fellow scholars. The main anchor course that everyone does do together is a course on leadership. That leadership course was developed on the Harvard Business School model, using case teaching methodology and using some of the content from the Harvard Business School course. But new content was developed so that the class covers case studies from many different sectors in business, in government, and in the nonprofit sector, and also so that the cases cover a broader geographical range, some from the United States, some from China, and some from other parts of the world, so that you get a leadership course that is as diverse in its content as the group of scholars whom we bring together in the program. The other 4 courses give you a sense of how China relates to the rest of the world economically, in terms of business, politically, and in terms of international relations, and also from a cultural and historical perspective, how China relates to the rest of the world. As I mentioned earlier, you'll do this core curriculum in a very intensive mode at the beginning of the year from August to November, and then you'll start to differentiate from each other. You'll choose one of 3 concentrations in public policy, economics and business, or international studies, and from November until roughly about the time of the Chinese New Year, the Spring Festival, you'll pursue a set of 4 courses in these fields. Though you'll have a larger menu to choose from, so everybody in those concentrations aren't doing exactly the same classes. And you'll craft your own set of interests within public policy, within economics and business, or within international studies. Before I move on to the later part of the year, what you do in the spring after the Chinese New Year and before graduation, I'll just mention that in these 2 earlier phases, all international Schwartzman scholars, so those who are coming to Tsinghua University from outside China, also share a Mandarin language requirement. For the Mandarin language program, we offer instruction at all levels. The program is neutral about your background in Mandarin language studies, so it means that we offer instruction for people who've never studied Mandarin in the past and are just beginning to learn basic vocabulary and the tones, all the way up to very advanced Mandarin language skills for those who speak fairly well and just need to improve their speaking abilities or really improve their academic writing abilities in the language. But regardless of where you are, we want you to advance over the course of the year. For the students who are native speakers of Mandarin, obviously they don't have a Mandarin language requirement, but we offer English language instruction at that time of the year. And the English language instruction focuses on very advanced skills for those students, advanced skills in writing or advanced presentation skills. I'll now say a little bit about what you do in the spring semester after you finish that period of very intensive coursework, and we'll also touch on a few other things that we do to expand your learning outside of the classroom. From about March until June, shortly before graduation, a great deal of your time will be invested in what we call the practical training program. You might think of it as being somewhat like an internship in a university in North America or in Europe, but it's actually different from internships in a number of ways. The practical training program is meant to give you the experience of learning in a workplace in Beijing, so it's very hands-on. But we do a few things that are different and reflect the goals of the Schwartzman Scholars Program and the unique nature of the experience that we want you to have. One thing we do is that we organize these practical training projects for you well in advance of when you're there in the workplace, in fact, in advance of your arrival in Beijing. We have built relationships with a wide variety of institutions in Beijing, some of them multinational corporations, some of them large Chinese corporations, some of them smaller Chinese startup firms. We have partnerships with a variety of international and nonprofit organizations that have offices in Beijing, and also with a much smaller number of Chinese government offices there in Beijing. That's actually pretty rare for international students to have the opportunity to work in a Chinese government office, but we think it's an important opportunity for you, so that's part of the mix. What you'll do on your practical training project is you'll execute a small, think of it almost like a consulting project where you come in with a team of your fellow Schwartzman scholars. The teams are on the scale of 2, 3, or 4 scholars, and your team will start a project and finish that project and then hand it over as a deliverable to the client that you're working for, essentially. Those projects vary enormously just depending on the kind of institution that you've been assigned to. So let me give you just some practical examples. There's a large private sector firm that had students do essentially a market study for them. And the market study involves research about their work in China, and the students are going to launch that study and complete that study and deliver the product to their client, but it's very much a marketing-focused kind of research project. In other instances, for example, with international organizations, the World Health Organization, for example, the students are going to have options of a number of different studies about the World Health Organization's work in China and conduct research that's primarily library and documents-oriented research, so they'll be based in Beijing while they're doing that, and once again deliver a report to their client at the end. In other cases, for example, with the small technology startup firms, the students are doing research about the implementation of a new product. Wide variety of different kinds of examples of what it is that the students might do, but the idea is that you get that hands-on experience of working in a workplace in China, whether it's understanding how multinational organizations get work done in the Chinese context or how Chinese organizations get work done in their own context. The experience is also very tightly integrated into your academic requirements for the program, and I think that's slightly different from a lot of internships that you may be familiar with in the past. The work is overseen by a faculty member from Tsinghua University, and it will provide you credit towards graduation with the degree. And then depending on what you want to do with it, you might also develop it out into your master's thesis. All of the students in the Masters of Global Affairs have a thesis requirement, and if you want to, you can link your practical training project to what you produce in your thesis, or if you prefer, you can produce a more traditional academic thesis that's based in library research. Let me say a little bit about some of the other learning experiences outside of the classroom. At a certain point in the year, actually in the fall, you'll have the opportunity to do what we call a deep dive travel seminar. With the deep dive travel seminars, you will go with a small group of your fellow scholars, not quite as small as the team that you worked with on practical training. Here the groups are more on the scale of 15 or 20 or 25 students. And you'll go to one part of the country away from the big cities like Beijing and Shanghai, and you'll study one particular topic in a very intensive way for 5 or 7 days with that group of students. You might pursue a business topic, a topic that's about public policy. I'll give you one example from this past year. We took a group of about 20 Schwarzman scholars to a city called Suzhou on the coast near Shanghai, and the students did an examination of the export industry, how the local government promotes the development of export companies and export business, and then how the local businesses develop and adapt and change their strategies as that government policy changes over time. We visited a variety of different kinds of companies while we were there in Suzhou, some of them very traditional manufacturing companies that are producing for export for a foreign company that's based in North America or in Europe. We visited Chinese companies that were doing similar manufacturing work for a global export market. And we visited some new companies in a very different sort of model. So, for example, a very innovative Chinese biotech firm that's doing cutting-edge pharmaceutical research, again for a global export market, but in this case, rather than producing that for a foreign firm, it was a group of Chinese innovators who had launched this company, and based on their experience working abroad, brought that experience back to Suzhou and are using Suzhou as a base to do export work and to do very high-end innovative research. The last thing that I'll mention here, while we're in this mode of talking about learning from your real-world experiences in China, is the mentorship program. We assign every Schwarzman scholar for the course essentially of the full year a very senior level mentor in his or her field to help them understand that professional field and also to help them develop their professional networks while they're there in China. Whether you're interested in business or in government policy or in the nonprofit world, we will assign you to someone who is either at or very close to the executive level in that field. So let me give you just a few examples. One young man in the current class who is interested in environmental policy has as his mentor the Minister of the Environment of the country. Another young man who's interested in the energy industry has the CEO of BP China as a mentor. And a young woman who's interested in the nonprofit world has the head of the Gates Foundation office in Beijing as her mentor. So you can see that we're aiming for fairly high-level connections for our students to ensure that they have a very high-level learning experience while they're students in Beijing. But we also hope that these very senior mentors stay on as a part of your professional network for the rest of your career and can serve as a connecting point for you back to China as you graduate and then go off and build your career. We want them to serve as that sort of professional resource for you on an ongoing basis. Everything that we're talking about in this webinar is covered entirely by the scholarship program. And the founder, Steve Schwarzman, and a number of other donors from around the world have contributed to this vision for one purpose, and that's to ensure that we're able to bring into the Schwarzman Scholars Network the most promising young leaders from around the world, from many different professions and many different countries, without consideration for their ability to pay. In some of the fields that Schwarzman scholars are going to pursue, the remuneration isn't necessarily as high as it might be in other fields, and we just want to be sure that Schwarzman scholars can be very diverse representation of many different kinds of leaders from around the world. So there's no charge on an academic side or on the experiential side for any of the things that we're talking about. I just alluded to the fact that the focal point of selecting Schwarzman scholars is choosing people who have the greatest potential to be leaders in the future, regardless of their ability to pay for the program. And the admissions process is also singularly focused on that same question of your potential to be a leader in your field. However it is you define that field, we're neutral about that question and actually very deliberately inclusive of many different professional fields in the program. But we do want the selection committee to have confidence in your potential to move later in life into leadership roles in your field. Over on the left side of the screen, you'll see a few things that are important to mention before you start working on an application, but actually are not part of our selection process. There's an upper age limit of 28 years on participants in the program, but where you fall in that age range of 18 to 28 is irrelevant in the decisions that we make in the selection process. Similarly, the program is completely open to any citizenship in the world, and we want to be very inclusive on that front, so we look to have many different countries represented in the program each year, but your citizenship is not a factor in the decision-making process. We're focused on whether or not you are likely to be a leader within your field and within your country, but we don't use your citizenship as a decision-making factor in deciding who we're going to bring into the program. I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Mandarin language program that we're neutral on this question of your Mandarin background, and I'll just repeat that again here to say that the program is completely open to all applicants regardless of how much Mandarin you have or haven't studied in the past. So there's no advantage or disadvantage on any level of Mandarin in the selection process. In the middle of the screen you see things that are important to us in helping us understand your academic background. It's a very intensive one-year master's program, so we're going to put some pretty heavy demands on you in terms of your ability to perform in the classroom, and we'll use your prior academic record to examine how likely you are to do well in that setting. But we're actually interested in a set of skills that are much broader than just your ability to perform in the classroom. We talk about looking at your intellectual agility, your ability to do well on a wide variety of different subjects in your academic studies, but also to transfer those analytical abilities outside of the classroom into all sorts of other problem solving. So we will look at your academic records to understand the diversity of your interests in the academic realm and your ability to perform well in the academic realm, but we're also going to ask at other points in the application, in particular in your letters of recommendation, for evidence of your ability to apply those skills in a wide variety of settings. Over on the right are things that we use primarily to try to assess your potential to take on leadership roles in the future. We'll ask you for 3 short essays that serve that purpose for us. One is a fairly broad personal statement where you give us a big picture overview of who you are, what you're interested in, and how those interests emerged over time. That kind of personal statement is probably familiar to you from lots of different application processes. The second essay is really the focal point of our efforts to try to understand your leadership abilities. And that's an essay where we ask you to share with us some very specific hands-on examples from your past where you've stepped into leadership roles or taken on leadership responsibilities, and to help us understand what kinds of personal characteristics help you succeed as a leader. And those may be very different from one person to another, or from one culture to another, or from one profession to another. We're actually very open in the way that we think about leadership, but we do want to hear of examples where you've seen an opportunity or a challenge of some sort, you took the initiative to find a solution to that opportunity or that challenge, where you inspired other people to join you in designing and delivering on that solution. And we want to hear about how you resolved resistance or conflicts or obstacles that got in your way to achieving your goal. So how you took initiative, when you took initiative, how you inspired other people to join you, and how you dealt with obstacles are the prompts that we offer you to help you think about your leadership experience. But we also invite you to tell us different kinds of stories from your own experience about your leadership. This is really about us really trying to understand who you are and what makes you successful when you step into leadership roles. The third essay is very different. You heard that the first two are very personal and very much about you. In the third essay, we ask you to write about some contemporary issue that you care about, but you're writing about that in a more distant and analytical way, as if you were writing, say, a short paper for a class or maybe an article for the student newspaper. But pick some issue that you care about and write about it so that we get a little bit of a sense of what your writing skills are like when you're a student in the classroom. The next thing you see here is a video, and this is really just a very informal opportunity for you to introduce yourself to the selection committee. I encourage you to think very carefully about what you write in those 3 essays that I just mentioned, but with the video, don't overthink it. Treat it as naturally as you can, as if you just bumped into one of the selection committee members in the elevator and you're just going to introduce yourself in the course of a short minute. We don't care about the production quality of this video. The audio quality needs to be good enough that we can hear you, but beyond that, don't really overthink either the production quality or the content. Just introduce yourself to someone as if you met them and we're giving them a quick hello. The resume is very straightforward. The only tip that I'll give you on that is that if you've mentioned some sort of experience or activity as being really critical to your understanding of who you are as a leadership, you want to make sure that that's reflected on your resume. Your letters of recommendation are fairly important to think through carefully, and what you want to do with these letters is to be sure that you give us a very balanced sense of yourself. If you're a currently enrolled student, one of those letters of recommendation needs to come from a faculty member. While you're a student at university, the faculty of the university are a very important part of your life, and they tend to also be people who know you fairly well. So one of those letters of recommendation needs to come from a faculty member and will probably comment primarily on your academic abilities and your ability, hopefully, to apply your analytical skills outside of the classroom. One of the letters of recommendation very definitely needs to comment on what you've told us about yourself in a leadership context. So look at what you've told us about your leadership experience or experiences, and think about who can write a letter that will help echo what you've said about yourself as a leader. And then what you do with the third reference letter is going to depend entirely on where you are in your personal and professional growth. If you're still an undergraduate at university, that third letter might also come from a university professor. If you have a lot of different kinds of leadership experiences, you might choose to use that third letter to round out the picture of your leadership experience. If you're further into your career, you might use that third letter to come from someone that you've worked with in the workplace who can comment on your professional abilities. So it's a little bit of a reflection of who you are and where you are professionally, and a little bit of your effort to give us a very balanced picture of yourself. For some students at some institutions, typically undergraduates at North American universities, there's a fourth letter that you can add to the mix, and that's an institutional assessment letter. Very typically comes from some central office at the university, like the Dean of Students, or possibly a fellowships office, or an honors college. And this letter is a letter that helps us understand who you are in the context of the university where you studied. So if you achieved some sort of remarkable accomplishment at that university, you were given some sort of unusual award at the university, you pursued an unusual program of academic study, this is someone in the central university administration who can just help us understand what it is that you did at that university and how it fits into and compares to the broader context of the university. That letter is mandatory for undergraduates at U.S. institutions, and then is an option for people who are either graduate students or students at other universities if your university provides that kind of service. Let me say a little bit about what we do with all of these materials, and at the same time I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of what the calendar is for. The application for U.S. and international students is going to open in April, and you'll have until the end of September to complete that application. The deadline this year is September 28th of 2017. And then we move pretty quickly after the applications are submitted to do our assessment. The first phase is a reading phase where we have readers who understand the different educational systems around the world and the different cultural backgrounds of our applicants. And they read applications. Every application is read by two people. If those two readers didn't agree with each other, then it's read by a third person. And those readers will then give us a recommendation of whether we should interview or not interview these candidates. In the reading phase, we typically have somewhere around 3,000 applications, and then based on those recommendations from readers, we'll invite a much smaller number, somewhere around 400 candidates, to come for face-to-face interviews. That reading phase happens fairly quickly early in October, so by the middle of October, you'll find out whether you've been invited to come for a face-to-face interview. The interviews are a fairly unusual experience, and one that's fairly enjoyable, certainly for those of us who serve as interviewers, and I think for quite a number of the candidates. In the interviews, you're going to sit with a panel of 5 or 6 people, many of whom are occupants of the sorts of leadership positions that we aspire Schwartzman Scholars to fill at some point in the future. So these are people who are business leaders, current or very recent CEOs of major global corporations. They are political leaders, many of them former heads of state, or in a few cases current heads of state, or people in charge of major ministries of government. Many heads of academic institutions, universities, and think tanks, heads of major nonprofit organizations, and then you'll also have a representative from Tsinghua University or the Schwartzman Scholars Program on your selection panel. And this group of people from their many different perspectives of leadership will interview you as a candidate, talk with you in a very conversational way about what you've said about yourself in your application, your academic background, your experiences of leadership. It's a very friendly kind of conversation, very much like a dinner conversation or a TV talk show. And it's meant to just help us understand who you are as a person and your background. It's not a gotcha kind of setting where they're trying to think of a question that you might not be able to answer. It stays fairly closely connected to what you've already told us about yourself as an applicant. After those interviews are finished, and they take place in different parts of the world, in Beijing, Singapore, London, and New York, we then make our decisions on a group level with input from all of those interview sites, and choose the next class of Schwartzman Scholars. The interviews take place late in October and early in November, and by the middle of November you'll know whether or not you've been invited to join the coming class of Schwartzman Scholars, and you'll have then a number of months to prepare for your arrival in Beijing. You're notified in November of 2017 and won't travel to Beijing until August of 2018. Let me just flag for people who may be listening to this webinar who are applicants from China, and by that we mean people who hold passports issued by mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Macau. If you hold one of those passports, your application is on a slightly different schedule. That schedule is adapted to correspond to the calendar with which Chinese graduate schools make their admissions decisions. So that application is already open. It's been open since early January. It will close on May 31st. So that deadline is at the end of May. And you will then find out fairly quickly in the middle of June if you've been invited for an interview, and the interviews take place all in Beijing in the first week of July. You'll then be notified about whether you've been selected to join the cohort of Schwartzman Scholars by the end of August, early September, so that you, if you're applying to other Chinese graduate programs, have that decision at the same time and can make your decision with all information in hand. I'm going to share with you now the contact information for the Schwartzman Scholars Program and encourage you, if you have questions about the admissions process, about the academic program, or even about the building, Schwartzman College, feel free to get in touch with us through info@schwartzmanscholars.org. But also, please consider joining us on the various social media channels that you see here. We're sharing a lot of information that's being developed over the course of the year, sharing the experience of the current class of Schwartzman Scholars, and you'll have access to all of that information by following us on WeChat, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. So please do follow us on Schwartzman on social media, but contact us through the email address if you have questions, or also feel free to join any of the live webinars that are going to be offered through the spring and summer to help people as they work on their applications. So once again, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this webinar, and we look forward to reading your application.